everybody, it's Lisa Arnold. Thanks for spending time with me today as we talk about opposites. What I'd love for you to do today before we get into talking about dismantling whiteness and unlearning racism is, can we just take a moment to look at this page here, take out a piece of paper and a pen, and just do a free write for 3 to 5 minutes on what you see here. And then come back and we'll go to page 2. Welcome back. We are now going to talk about opposites. Opposites are very important because it is through opposites that we know the world. We know the world through opposites. From our very first picture book as babies, we are taught to see the world this way, through opposites. Up, down. Opposites are just pairs or dualisms. Dualisms are something divided in two. And so they are normally take the form of nouns and adjectives. Some examples of pairs or dualisms that are opposites are good, bad, right, wrong, yes, no, white, black, man, woman, human, animal, culture, nature, me, you, us, them, here, there. But it's important that we remember that dualisms are not just independent nouns and adjectives that name and define. They are a power-laden value system of categorization. And so what they're doing is categorizing. And so let us remember that to categorize is actually a verb. So what we need to do is not look at the nouns and adjectives. Let's focus on the verb and ask, what do opposites do? How do they function? Well, we can think about opposites as functioning as a team. Opposites work together to create power norms. They negate, they oppose, they relate, they value and rank, define, and normalize. Well, what do we mean by that? Let's look at the list. Opposites negate. They make us think this, not that. They make us think that the elements in a pair are mutually exclusive. What else do? They oppose. They make us think this is against that. They make us see the elements in resistance. Opposites exist in relationship. They exist in that this is tied to that. They are mutually dependent. Opposites also value and rank. They verticalize our ideas. They make us see this over that. They define. Opposites limit our ideas of something. They lessen our notions of something. They limit this to that. And in the end, all of this works together to create a norm. They normalize us to think that this is this, that is that, inherently. The problem is that opposites secretly signal our prejudices and privilege. So let's take a look at an example. Let's look at white and black and see how do they function as opposites in terms of how they negate, oppose, relate, rank, etc. So let's start here. How does black and white function in terms of negation? How do they negate? They make us see that white is not black. White is different than black. White is separate than black. There are variations of negation. Opposites also oppose. They make us see things in resistance, and they work in degrees. They make us think that white is against black, that white can hate black, that white hurts black. Opposites exist in relationship, in context and association. But this is multifaceted. We have to understand that the relationships between opposites are situational and exist in historical context. How do we think about blackness and whiteness when the Constitution was being written for the United States of America? How is blackness and whiteness being thought of in Minneapolis, Minnesota after the murder of George Floyd? We have to think of opposites in side-by-side relationship. How do we think of whiteness without thinking of blackness? Our ideas of blackness only exist in relationship to our ideas of whiteness. They depend on one another. Another way that opposites relate is compared with other pairs. We can only think about whiteness and blackness when we know about goodness and badness. Our notions of men and women help us think of what we think about black and white, what we think about good and bad, what we think about humans and animals. They work as a system together. But they don't work just as a horizontal system. They work as a ranking system in terms of levels of value. It verticalizes our ideas and makes us see white over black, white above black, white as the boss of black, white as smarter than black. It creates what we call a hierarchical dualism system, where we put good over bad, right over wrong, white over black, man over woman, culture over nature, human over animal. And then that makes us put a value system that is in association and context. What do we see as good and right? Good and right? We see white man culture. We see humans on the top. What do we see as bad and wrong? Black woman nature. We see animals on the bottom. And these are hierarchical dualisms. So these hierarchical dualisms work together. Opposites work together to create a definition that freezes an identity. It locks in identity. It solidifies it, and in doing so, lessens it. If someone defined you to lessened you to two adjectives, to your ethnicity, the color of your skin, your education, that would lessen the idea of you. So our definitions of things freeze the gesture of thinking, as Desserteau tells us. It fails to let us see that it's a construct of nature and culture, that it's not inherent. We have to see that these definitions exist as an interconnected system. We see this interconnected system down here, and that it plays out by individuals and in society. And they seek to tell us what is. So opposites make us ask, what is black and white? But the question, what is insufficient. We have to see that the binary has failed. What we need to do now is we need to ask more useful questions. A more useful question is how. Let's switch from what is to how does. How does. How do notions of whiteness and blackness serve the person, the people, and the power? How do notions of whiteness serve George Floyd? How does notions of whiteness serve African Americans in Minneapolis? How do notions of whiteness serve the police force? How do notions of whiteness serve politics? Answer: to normalize power imbalance. So all of these things now work together to put together a norm. We tend to get a cultural value that puts white as superior, black as inferior. And more disgraceful even than that notion there is that we see it as inherent. We see it based on nature and culture. So it works to define stereotypes. And if we see this as the norm, as inherent, as natural, we can use that to justify oppression, to jail mass quantities of African American men. So we need to instead start asking, how? How does the norm function? For whom does the norm function? How does power operate given our notions of blackness and whiteness, of goodness and badness, of human, of animal? Let's look at the repercussions. The repercussions are a power imbalance, and that is played out through political policy and individual behavior on physical material bodies, human, animal, and earth. Think about political policy, think about housing, think about education, think about access. Think about the humans on which this is played out on. African Americans in society. How are How are women treated in society? How are animals treated? Think about factory farms. Think about your meals. How are we treating Earth? If we put humans on top and Earth on the bottom, that can justify oppression, pollution, degradation. So we need to act. Let us take action. Let's denormalize the norm. Let's see all of this as a construct. It's not inherent. Let's start with ourselves, examine our own ideas and values, beliefs, behaviors, and then let's examine our culture, our communities, ideas, values, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors. Don't just flip the binary. Let's crack it open. Let's ask the right questions. Think in terms of fluidity, in flux, and examine our own assumed superiority. When we do that, we can see that all oppression is related and all liberation intertwined. We have to hold multiple truths at once. We can't see that good is here, bad is there. White is here, black is there. Man, woman. What we have to do is disrupt that in our thinking. We have to hold that sometimes we can, something happens and we think, oh, that was terrible that happened. And then we think, oh, thank goodness that happened because that led me to X, Y, and Z. Or we can say that that goodness and badness, this person's good, that person's bad. But if we hold multiple truths, we have to see that everyone's got capacity, capability to do good and to do bad. And that even though we might have the best thoughts, the best intentions, there can still be bad outcomes. So we have to always think of these things in flux. When we understand all of this, we see that racism is systemic. We see it's part of our language, we see it's part of our culture, and we see that it's intersectional. Language is part of culture. Culture is part of language. And if we understand that racism is intersectionally constructed, it's an intersectional construction, it demands and commands intersectional deconstruction. So, we need to understand that my liberation is tied to yours, your liberation is tied to mine. We need to examine assumed superiority of ourselves and others. Don't believe everything you think. We have to question authority, ours and others. Think about how we use opposites, how we think about opposites, what that does for our notions of self and other. Remember that learning is unlearning, and now that you know, you have to teach another. So let's share our knowledge. Let's share our quest for justice. And if we're looking for justice for George Floyd, let's start with ourselves. Let's ask a lot of questions. And let's look at how opposites operate in our lives and society, because Black Lives Matter. Go to blacklivesmatter.com. Donate your time, body, voice, money, and mind. And let's start the change today. Thanks.